Hello and welcome to Livewire's Undiscovered series for 2024. My name is Chris Conway. Today we're sitting down with Hashan De Silva, the founder and managing partner of KPRX, which is a venture capital firm focused on healthcare opportunities in Australia and New Zealand. Hashan, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
For those who are unfamiliar, can you just briefly outline the philosophy of the fund and what you're trying to achieve for investors?
We believe where we sit in the market is that there's a significant inefficiency in the pricing and the valuation of healthcare assets in Australia. And that's really driven by the lack of specialist healthcare money in Australia when you look at it on a kind of a per capita basis. But on the other side, we see a lot of companies and a lot of opportunities. We actually generate more healthcare patents per capita than anyone else in the world, and even on an absolute basis, we're in the top 5, sometimes in the top 10. And so there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of great IP, but very little capital available to invest in those companies. In addition to that, where we sit at the what we call the proof of concept stage. Drug companies at phase 2, medical device companies close to commercialization. And there is actually even less capital for companies at that stage. And we believe that is where an investor should be focusing to help companies scale up, commercialize, and that's where you generate all the value. And so that's where KPRX really sits.
Who are the investors backing KPRX, those that were backing it from the beginning, and why is that important for potential investors?
I used to work at a fund out of Hong Kong called Cast Peak. And so many of the listeners might be aware of Cast Peak's been a very successful healthcare investor in Australia for the last 10 years. I joined Cast Peak as the head of healthcare. And so throughout my time at Cast Peak, we had a very good run. And as a function of that, the founder has changed Cast Peak from being a fund into a family office. And so he's seeding my new fund. So Cast Peak was a Tiger Cub. So originally spun out Tiger Asset Management, so it makes us a Tiger Grand Cub.
Right.
In addition to the support of my previous employer, there are 3 other family offices that were either investors or co-investors with Cast Peak, but the bulk of the money is actually coming from healthcare entrepreneurs. So we've got a group of about 15 healthcare entrepreneurs that for the most part were founders, management of our portfolio companies who are now back in the new venture. Right. So they include the likes of Dr. Chris Behrenbrook, founder of Telix, Patrick Davies, the chairman of Neuron, Lou Panaccio, who's a serial entrepreneur, chairman of many companies, including Sonic. And I think that tells future investors that the people that know healthcare in Australia are the ones backing the fund, but also tells our future companies, our future investment, our portfolio companies that we were good to work with. And so I think that sends a pretty strong signal to both investors and future companies.
Just a quick follow-up question there, Hashan, if I may. Those people that have built those amazing companies that you just referred to, are they in any way involved in an advisory role or helping with the investments in the fund?
Yeah, I mean, I speak to most of them on a regular basis,
right. And
being able to bounce ideas off them, I think, is invaluable. And so they're absolutely aligned with the investors of the fund because, I mean, their primary involvement with KPRX is as an investor. And so it's great having them on board.
Yeah, I bet. Let's talk about the healthcare market in Australia and New Zealand from a deal flow perspective and capital availability. You sort of referenced it before, but what does it look like at the moment?
Yeah, so we start on the kind of the company side. So when we meet foreign investors, particularly out of the US, the thing that we tell them that differentiates the Australian market is that you get Series B, so that later stage companies, for the same or similar valuation as a pre-seed in the US. So if you use Neuron as an example, we invested in Neuron after they'd done a phase 2B, after they'd partnered the drug to a multi-billion-dollar NASDAQ-listed company who was funding all future development, and the market cap was 70 million or 50 million US. Yeah. So that kind of valuation, you don't get. 50 million valuation in the US is a pre-seed stage company. Mm-hmm. The other thing that is very different in Australia to pretty much every market in the world is the generosity or the government support available for biotechs. So straight out of the bat, the federal government pays for 45% of all R&D costs through the R&D rebate. And so that's not a future tax offset or any kind of future gain. That is, at the end of the calendar year, the federal government refunds your R&D expense. Right. So straight away, for a company that needs to spend $20 million on R&D to fund an asset, they only have to raise $11.5 million of that. The rest of it is funded by the federal government. In addition to that, we've got world-class research institutions that make doing early stage clinical trials in Australia far cheaper and quicker than the US. And so, a CT scan in Australia costs a couple $100, it costs a couple $1,000 in the US. An MRI costs about $500 in Australia, costs $5,000 in the US. But we have an ethnically diverse population, which means that you can do a lot of the clinical work in Australia, and it mirrors the population for much of the developed world, which is different to a lot of other markets that can do clinical trials cheaply. And so putting it all together, what do we have in Australia, right? We have world-class healthcare IP being generated, and then in order to develop that healthcare IP, you can do that with the federal government funding essentially half of that clinical development in an environment where it's a lot cheaper to do clinical trials. Our companies have to raise far less money to do what they need to do than a similar US company. Right. And then on the flip side, on the capital availability, I once sat on a panel where there was 4 Australian healthcare VCs and 1 US VC. And that US VC, that one fund, had more money than our entire ecosystem, right? Not the 4 people sitting on the panel.
Yep, the whole thing.
The whole entire ecosystem.
Right.
Australian VC funds, healthcare VC funds, tend to focus on pre-seed, seed stage company, spinning IP out of universities, what I call science projects. Mm-hmm. But if you're a company that is at phase 2 stage that needs to raise $20, $30, $40 million to fund a large phase 2B clinical trial, you have very few places in Australia to do that. Very few, I mean less than probably 3 funds that kind of specialize in that space. So what we find in Australia is it's not very competitive amongst healthcare VCs. It's actually quite collaborative. I speak to my colleagues on a regular basis. Yep. And so we can find great companies, negotiate very attractive entry prices, and take a meaningful stake in these companies, which you normally wouldn't be able to do in a competitive market like the US.
Hashan, you've referenced a couple of times the focus on phase 2 clinical stage or early commercial stage assets just prior to the inflection point of value creation. I understand that, but can you give us some examples of exactly what that looks like when you're considering these investments? Yeah,
and so the reason why we tend to focus on those kind of later stage investments is in Australia, and we've seen this, you don't actually get any benefit from investing earlier. I mean, any financial benefit from investing earlier. And so I used Neuren as an example before, right? We invested in that company at a 70 mil market cap. At that stage, I think it had been listed for 20 years. It had raised 100 million as a listed company. I don't know how much it had raised as a private company. The company was raised in 1995. Mm-hmm. We invested in 2020. And so if you look at where the value has been created for investors, it has been after our investment, after the phase 3 trial was positive, after the FDA was approved the drug, after the drug was commercially available. And so the reason why we think that happens in Australia and doesn't happen in the US is that in the US it's quite competitive. There's hundreds of biotech VCs. So there are people fighting for and valuing the de-risking that happens in the earlier stages.
Right.
You don't have that in Australia. So if you invest super early, pre-seed, seed, in preclinical stage company, you take on astronomical risk, significant time of development, and then you don't get rewarded for that because an investor like myself comes in and invests at a $50 million valuation. And so that's really why we focus on the later stage.
Hashan, you've talked about Neuren and the success that you had there. Are there any other investments that you just wanted to share with the audience?
Yeah, maybe I'll share 2 really quickly. The first one being Telix. So that's a company that I personally followed for a long time. I actually, when I worked at Macquarie Bank, I'd published research on it going on 2017, 2018. Right. And that's a great example of really, and where Australia has a competitive advantage. Somehow, Australia has become a world leader in radiopharmaceuticals. We've got some amazing infrastructure that's been built in Australia through collaborations with ANSTO. The University of Wollongong has developed some incredible IP around detection of isotopes. And so Telix kind of really sat in the middle of that. And you had a founder, CEO that was an absolute expert in radiopharmaceuticals, being Dr. Chris Behrenbruch. And so that was a company that we were able to invest in. So the company was about to launch their new drug application to the FDA. So all the clinical work had been done. We were getting in after, just before revenue, if you will. Right. And we had a very good kind of belief that it would be approved, and there was a massive unmet need. It was one of the few times in clinical medicine where a product was written into guidelines that you had to use PSMA imaging, and yet no product existed to be able to do that. So we knew the first product or second product to market would have massive demand, and that's kind of played through. The other one I'd quickly raise is a company called CurveBeam AI. Mm-hmm. So we invested in that company when it was a private business, and we invested in that company at a pre-money valuation of 17 mil. This company had been in existence for 10 years before our investment, had done all their clinical work, had done a trial in 2,000 women that showed their diagnostic worked, and they were just pre-revenue. So we invested in that business. We helped them do a merger with their technology partner in the US to form Curbeam AI, and now we've subsequently listed that business. And so we were able to list that business at a market cap of 150 million on the ASX. So normally a $150 million IPO might not be a success story, but because there is so much margin for error for us, because we invested at a 17 mil pre-money, that was actually quite a good success. And we continue to own that position. We haven't sold any of that position because we see kind of a bright future for Curbeam. So they've gone from no revenue when we invested to about $12-ish million of revenue. They've done a partnership with Stryker, listed on the ASX, and we think there's a bright future to come.
Hashan, in a research report, it was written that Carspeak is known to conduct some of the most extensive due diligence prior to investing. So your diligence standards are quite well known. What are 3 critical factors that you look for when you're doing that due diligence?
The way I look at these kind of healthcare companies, every one of them is like a fingerprint. No two are similar at all. And it's very difficult to have like a framework that is reproducible across different investments. But I guess just as a general way of thinking, the first thing I would say that they need is intellectual property. It sounds like it should be taken for granted, right? These companies should have intellectual property. Not always the case, right? So you need to look at what intellectual property they are, what are the claims, and their freedom to operate. The next thing I think that you really have to look at is how does their drug or device fit into the treatment landscape, right? Think when you're looking at a company, let's say they're in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. Look at what their drug does in comparison to everything else that is available to treat that patient and everything that is being developed, and understand how that will fit in versus the efficacy and also the side effects. For a medical device, it's even more important. What does the doctor have to do differently to use your medical device? Because not only do you now have to get your medical device approved, do all the clinical trials show that worked, you have to now go in and teach a doctor to do something different. Right. That is not easy. And then the final thing is always look at what else is in development. Do not, what I like to call, do innovation in isolation, right? Because there are no boundaries, there are no borders in healthcare. Something being developed in Estonia could make what you're looking at in Australia obsolete. So have a global view, look at everything in development. Do not look at just the company or just that asset in isolation.
Hashan, focusing again on the investment process, what is different to everyone else who's available out there in the space?
I think one thing that we do quite differently, and I think it's a bit of a tiger model, we don't have an internal advisory board. And the reason why we don't have an internal advisory board is I don't believe that you can create an advisory board with a group of people that can answer every question you need to have answered on medicine. So everything is hyper specialized, that we have to go out and find the key opinion leaders in that area. So if you use Neuron as an example, their drug treats an ultra rare pediatric condition called Rett syndrome. So let's say I had an advisory board of 10 people and one person happened to be a neurologist. Likely that person had never heard of Rett syndrome, let alone treated a patient. And so what we do on a deal by deal, company by company basis is create an advisory board, if you will, per company. And so with Neuron, there are 20 centers of excellence for Rett syndrome. We spoke to every single one of them. We spoke to the Rett Syndrome Trust, the Research Foundation, patient advocacy groups. I flew over to the US a couple of times, went to a few different conferences, even one for parents, where I got to see the parents and the daughters and got to meet everyone in the treatment continuum, including the physiotherapists, the speech pathologists, et cetera, et cetera. And through that process, we create a group of 5 to maybe 15 max people that we think are the key opinion leaders. And so that is very important when you're doing DD and deciding which companies you want to actually enter and invest in. But we've found that is also very, very important when you're deciding when to exit, when to sell, which is equally as important, I think. And so Neuron, the phase 3 trial was positive, the stock price was $3. We didn't exit. Just before FDA approval, the stock price was $8. We didn't exit. After FDA approval, the stock price is $14, and we didn't exit. And why didn't we exit? Because we were speaking to people that were treating patients on the ground, and we had a very, very good understanding of what the ramp up would be like, what the insurance landscape would be like, and pushback from insurance, and what the early kind of sales would look like. And for instance, the consensus for the first quarter of commercial sales was 2.5 million. We thought, we had personally spoken to one doctor who was on our advisory board, that had prescribed the drug more than consensus estimate.
Wow.
And so what was the first quarter of sales? It was $23 million US, right? And so we were able to have a very high degree of confidence what the early commercial ramp up would be. And so we were able to hold our stock. On the flip side, we used to be the largest shareholder of Avita. We own 20% of that company. The stock went very quickly from $1 to $18. And so before investing, we had done a quantitative survey of 50 burn centers out of a possible 200 burn centers. So we had a very, very good sample size and a very good understanding of what the total addressable market would look like and what the ramp would look like. And so when the stock ran as hard as it did, we actually exited the entirety of our position on market in block trades to other institutional investors. And the reason why we were able to do that is because we'd created a group of people that had told us exactly what the market looked like. And lo and behold, the stock had fallen. I think it went back down to $2. That is the key thing that makes us very, very different from other investors in the space. And to your point before, I mean, we're very, very thorough. I've hired private investigators to do background checks on management teams when I think it's warranted. And in one instance, that saved us from making a bad investment because the head of sales was being sued by his former employer for IP theft. So we go very, very, very deep.
Just a follow-up question there. It sounds like that DD process is exhaustive, shall we say. How long can it take? Are you looking at these opportunities for, let's call it 2 years before you finally decide to pull the trigger? Can there be that much work that goes into crossing the T's and dotting the I's?
Definitely. I mean, I tell all other companies, even if it's too early, even if you're too early for my fund mandate, it's great to meet. Let's meet when you're preclinical. Let's build a relationship. Let's follow the journey. So when we're ready to invest, well, I've known you for 2-3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we can be quick when we need to. So, but it generally still takes about at least 3 to 4 weeks to do the DD. But in that situation, that's when we're like, we love this. We love the idea of this. Let's put everything else on the back burner and just focus on this one thing.
And there's no red flags.
And there's no red flags. Everything is kind of ticks as we go.
Yeah. Hashan, last question, and I think the only question worth asking now that we've been through all of that, what are you focusing on at the moment in terms of opportunities?
So we've actually gone through the biggest downturn in the healthcare valuations and healthcare indices, particularly the XBI, I believe ever. It's been the longest and the deepest downturn that has ever happened in the modern capital markets as a healthcare investor. So that actually means it's an amazing time to be buying. The whole age-old adage of buy low, sell high. Yeah. This is low. This is the time when you need to be allocating capital. And what we've seen in Australia, in particular in the private space, is that the generalist investors, high net worths, they've largely left the market. And the specialist investors, there's a few that are tapped out and no longer allocating capital. And so we've been able to create an incredible amount, a very attractive deal flow pipeline that we think we will be able to deploy the capital very quickly into. And there are some areas that we think are very, very attractive, very late stage companies that we think are 3-4 years away from a multi-billion-dollar exit that we are able to enter. One company in particular, I think we'll be able to enter at a $20 million valuation. That is 3 years and a phase 2B trial away from a multi-billion-dollar exit. So we're very, very excited to get investing.
Sounds like now's the time to get involved.
Definitely.
Hashan, thanks for chatting with Livewire.
It was great to be here.
If you enjoyed that interview for Livewire's Undiscovered series, make sure to give it a like and don't forget to follow our YouTube channel because we're adding lots of great content every single week.